Our next speaker is Marta Haniszewski, who's coming to us from Alexion, which is a part of AstraZeneca Rare Disease. And Marta is talking to us today about a bit of an overview about how drugs come to market in Canada. This is a topic I knew nothing about, and I still only know probably this much about. But you know what? It's a big part of our lives. We need to understand, how do these things happen? How do groups decide? What groups decide what's coming to Canada and what's available? Um, and so I'm really thrilled that we can have Marta here to speak. As part of her role, I'll just quickly say, Marta helps to ensure that rare disease medicines are covered by insurers, which is obviously something that's important here in Canada. So please help me welcome Marta to our session today.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. All right, perfect. So thank you, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon here from Toronto. And thank you again to the symposium organizers as well for giving me the chance to speak today. So I think we've had a bit of an intro, but as said, I'll be talking really just about, understanding how drugs come to Canada, the multi-step process that it is, and of course, some of the challenges that drugs face, especially drugs for rare disease. So as a brief intro, I think it goes without saying that the process of drug approval and funding in Canada is complex. So generally today we'll be talking about public drug approvals especially, and that can be kind of broken down into a 4-step process that involves a number of different stakeholders. So the first step is, of course, regulatory approval. So really answering that question of, should the drug even be sold in Canada? The second is that assessment of value of the drug through health technology assessment. And then steps 3 and 4 is really understanding, is the really negotiation phase and kind of actually listing the drug so that it can finally become available to patients. So this is the perspective of public drug plans, so provincial plans and also some federal plans as well. And I won't really talk too much about private insurance, but that's a parallel process that still follows some of the similar kind of steps and questions, but kind of occurs separately. So we introduced that this is a multi-step process and involves a lot of stakeholders. So essentially what that ends up meaning for Canadian patients is that the whole process actually takes quite a long amount of time. So as you can see, each of these bars represents kind of briefly that process that we've talked about so far. So the first being, again, regulatory approval, then that health technology assessment, step 2, and then steps 3 and 4, that negotiation and listing. And you can really see that a lot of that time actually comes from steps 3 and 4, and that can be a very, rate limiting step in the process. And this specifically is looking at orphan drugs or drugs for rare disease, and it can be sometimes longer for drugs, for other drugs as well. If we look at Canada very broadly, just compared to other countries from the OECD, we actually see that Canada performs pretty poorly. So we do have a really long time from the drug being, available in general to actually being then listed on public reimbursement. So I won't spend too much time on this graph because it is quite complicated, but generally, as we can see, that kind of that green bar, that really launch of the drug in Canada to public reimbursement is quite long and is quite long, especially compared to a lot of different countries, especially in Europe. So let's start from step 1. As we talked about, drug authorization is really the first step that comes in the process. And this is essentially answering, again, that question, can this drug even be available in Canada? And that's answered by Health Canada. So Health Canada is our national or federal regulator. So it's responsible for really reviewing drugs and ensuring that they are appropriate for sale in Canada through the Health Products and Food Branch. So essentially, this is our equivalent of the FDA in the US. So Health Canada really looks, again, at that safety, efficacy, and quality of the drug, and really answers that question of, can this drug be sold in Canada? Is it appropriate? It's important to note that Health Canada doesn't look at the value or the cost of the drug. It really is just looking about safety and efficacy. So when Health Canada does its review of a new drug, or a new indication of a drug. If the drug is deemed appropriate, that's when it will receive that notice of compliance, or NOC, which you might have heard before. And then, of course, the drug also gets an independent identification number, and then it can be sold in Canada. Now, if we talk about drugs for rare disease again, so, the timelines for a standard review is around 300 days. And again, those are timelines. So things can obviously take longer than the standard. But Health Canada doesn't really have a special review pathway for drugs for rare disease. And indeed, in Canada, there's no official, designation or definition of what is a drug for rare disease or an orphan drug, as there might be, for example, in Europe. So essentially, drugs for rare disease don't necessarily receive special treatment. Now, they can go through these two accelerated pathways. So the first of those being the notice of compliance with conditions. So this is essentially conditional approval. So the drug is reviewed under a standard of around 200 days, so a bit faster. And then after that, there has to be additional evidence provided that the drug is actually safe and effective over time. The other accelerated pathway is priority review. So this can be a review performance standard of around 180 days, so almost half of that of a standard review, and is, of course, a lot faster. But it's important to note that both of these are not guaranteed for drugs for rare disease. So again, these are specifically review standards that are for severely debilitating diseases, and the drug needs to have substantial evidence that it really helps in this disease. And it needs to be a disease where, there are no available drugs, or the drugs that are available so far are not good enough. So of course, a lot of the times drugs for rare disease might go through this pathway, but it's not a guarantee. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit just about some of the resources and some of the things to keep in mind when it comes to regulatory approval. So as we said, in order for a drug to even be sold in Canada, it has to receive that notice of compliance. Before that happens, though, Health Canada does allow healthcare professionals to request a drug through its special access programs. So again, this is only open to health professionals, but it is an opportunity to gain early access to a drug, and only, of course, when there is a significant need, and this is not to circumvent the normal processes. Two other important resources to keep in mind are the submissions under review database. So this is really helpful for keeping up to date with what's happening, being aware of the reviews that are ongoing, and kind of anticipating what drugs might come to Canada, and the drug product database, which can be used to find the drugs that have been already approved. And there you can find the product monograph. So that's essentially the detailed overview of the drug, how it can be used, and the evidence behind that. So when it comes to drugs for rare disease, unsurprisingly, we see more and more of those coming to Canada. So that's a good thing, an exciting thing. And we can see the number of drugs receiving a notice of compliance over time is increasing. So that is encouraging. But of course, as we said, regulatory approval is only the first step in the drug pathway, and there's still a lot more to come. So step 2, as we talked about, the next step is the HTA, or Health Technology Assessment step. And this is answering that second question of, does this drug provide good value to the Canadian society? So very briefly, Health Technology Assessment is kind of a standard review process that looks at not only just the clinical efficacy and safety of a product, but looks at its broader value. So that's economic value and societal value, and acceptability of the product from ethical or social perspectives. So again, this is a very comprehensive and rigorous review. A lot of different viewpoints, a lot of different stakeholders are involved, and essentially after this review, a recommendation is issued. So as we'll see, it really depends on the jurisdiction, but this recommendation is not necessarily binding. And then afterwards, decision makers can use this recommendation to actually decide whether the drug can be made available. So in Canada, we actually have 2 health technology assessment bodies. And again, these undergo a very thorough and rigorous review of, first of all, the clinical evidence, but then also the economic evidence. So answering, what are the actual costs associated with funding this drug, and what are the kind of expected health benefits or economic benefits of the drug over time. So that's where that kind of modeling of different outcomes actually comes into play. Important to note is that this health technology assessment is also that broader perspective. So again, patients and clinicians actually have the opportunity to share their perspective, and that perspective is taken into account, and the societal perspective as well. So the two HTA bodies in Canada that we have is INES, which advises the Quebec Ministry of Health, and then CADIT. So CADIT is our pan-Canadian body that advises all of the different provinces except for Quebec, and also any of the national plans or Canadian Blood Services. Now, both INES and CADIT can provide 3 types of recommendations. So the first of those is the reimburse or listing recommendation. So essentially saying this drug is good to go, we recommend listing. The second one is the most commonly seen, which is the reimburse with clinical criteria or conditions or conditional listing. So essentially saying that the drug does provide relevant benefits and that it should be listed, but something needs to be changed. And generally, that is a statement that the costs of the drug are too high, and that the costs need to be reduced. And then the third is the rejection or the do not reimburse or do not list results. Now, as I mentioned before, these are just recommendations. So these recommendations are actually non-binding. And just because CADIT provides a positive recommendation doesn't necessarily mean that the drug will be funded by the relevant provinces, and the same for INES. This is actually in contrast to some other countries, such as, for example, the UK, where if that relevant HTA body provides a positive recommendation, the drug will actually be listed. So in Canada, this is almost a formal step, but not necessarily leads to anything. Now, of course, nothing is simple. So the CADIT review process itself is also very complex. It involves many steps and many stakeholders as well. And as we said, this involves both CADIT stakeholders, expert review committees, and clinicians. The drug plans themselves can also participate. And of course, that input from clinicians and patients is welcome as well. So the target for this review is around 190 calendar days as well. Now, again, this is quite an important piece, and I want this to be kind of almost a key message that comes through our talk today, is that, this is the really opportunity for patients and clinicians to be able to participate and share their feedback. So as you said, both CADIT and INES provide that opportunity for patients to comment, and they have kind of standard templates that can be filled out. And essentially, these are an opportunity for stakeholders to share their perspective on what is this disease, how does it affect patients, what is the current standard of care, and is that good enough, and what would patients expect from a new drug? And so I really encourage you to take the time to see this part of the, for example, CADIT's website, and see the open calls for input, and really see the opportunities to comment on relevant drugs, since it is such a critical aspect of making sure that your voice is heard. Now, jumping back to the concept of drugs for rare disease. So unsurprisingly, we don't really have a separate pathway for these in Canada at the level of health technology assessment either. So there are kind of considerations, of course, that CADIT has for disease rarity. So taking into account that the disease is rare, that the disease is life-threatening. Obviously, this is taken into consideration. And of course, evidence for a drug for rare disease can be lower than for a large drug. Or large population, right? Of course, our clinical trials are going to be smaller. Some of the evidence might not be as good. So, CADIT does kind of account for this, but it's not a separate review pathway. And there's not separate thresholds, for cost effectiveness as there might be in other jurisdictions. CADIT also has this relatively new complex review pathway. So it's kind of similar, but it provides more opportunity for consultation with clinical experts. But again, not every single drug for rare disease is going to be eligible for this pathway. And so there is this kind of need to define more clearly how can rare disease drugs be assessed differently and more appropriately. Same for INES, there's no separate pathway necessarily for drugs for rare disease, but across the different parameters that INES does measure, that fourth and fifth parameters are really looking at the impact of the drug on the population and the kind of social perspective. So really, what does this mean for Quebec patients, and why is this drug important? Does kind of provide that opportunity to take into account a more drug for rare disease perspective. All right, so that was step 2. We finally finished our recommendations. Now what actually happens? So that's step 3 and 4 of that first pathway. So really the actual listing and negotiation aspect of the pathway. So this is where the actual funders of the drug, so again, from a public perspective, the different drug plans come together and really decide, okay, are we actually going to add this to our formularies? Is this going to be available to patients? So in Canada, this generally happens through the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, or PCPA, which is essentially just a coalition of all the public drug plans that come together and negotiate. So again, these come together, they take that feedback from the HTA reviews, especially from CADIT, they take that recommendation and they come together and decide whether they will, first of all, negotiate, and if they will negotiate, what kind of criteria, for example, will they expect. Now, it's important to note that the PCPA is responsible for negotiating the confidential net price of the drug and the initiation and renewal criteria. So essentially, when a drug is listed, the actual price that, for example, provinces are paying is not publicly available, and it's not the same price as is publicly known. The public or list price is actually regulated by a separate body, the Patented Medicines Price Review Board, which you may have heard of, and that is a separate kind of process. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind, that the price that is publicly available is not necessarily the price that actually public funders are paying. So the PCPA negotiation is, of course, also a multi-step process. The first aspect is, again, that initiation and consideration. So really thinking about, do public payers want to negotiate? Is this negotiation going to actually happen? And this is, of course, dependent on the need, whether the drug plans think that the product is important. And of course, it's also informed by the recommendations that were received from HTA. After that, we go into the negotiation phase, and then the negotiations can be completed with a letter of intent. So essentially, the objectives of the PCPA is that kind of joint negotiation. So of course, this makes a lot of sense. The idea is to make sure that clinically relevant and cost-effective treatments are available to Canadians. It's to ensure, of course, that drug costs can be lowered, and also to kind of improve consistency. So the idea is that all provinces come together, all provinces agree on the appropriate price and, of course, the appropriate criteria, and that way, access is more equitable in theory. It's important to note that, of course, at any given time, the number of drugs that are being reviewed or negotiated by the PCPA is quite high. And again, this is across many different diseases, many different jurisdictions with different priorities and different budgets. And so these negotiations can actually be quite complex and can involve many, many rounds of going back and forth and determining the appropriate criteria and, of course, the appropriate price. It's important to note that, of course, not all negotiations are successful. So if we look at the number of completed negotiations, around 75 of those ended up without an agreement. And for those drugs, there's no clear next steps. So the negotiation process is complete once there is a mutually agreed upon terms. So again, that mutually agreed upon price and specific terms of when a patient can receive a drug. So of course, some provinces want to make sure that patients try the available drugs before they can even receive this new drug. If the terms are agreed upon, that's when this letter of intent, or LOI, is signed. Now, of course, as we said, not all of these negotiations are successful. Sometimes mutually agreed upon terms are just not reached, and then a closed letter is actually issued instead. So even after completion of this LOI, saying that we've reached the terms, we have a contract, this is not actually the last step. So step 4 is actually that listing step. So now the manufacturer of the drug has to actually work with each individual province and to set up a product listing agreement. And then finally, that's when the drug is actually available to patients. It's important to note that the letter of intent is not binding. So even though in theory all the provinces agreed, some of them may not actually list the drug very soon, or may still want to change the terms. So there's also no clause about how soon the drug has to be listed on the formularies. So again, there's kind of a delay here from actual agreement to the drug being funded. Of course, the PCPA also has timelines, but if we look at the target timelines, the entire process is expected to take around 200 calendar days again, so another significant delay. And a lot of that time, the negotiation is targeted to take around 90 business days, but that doesn't always happen. And we can see that the percent of targets that are met, you can see most drugs are relatively quickly through the initiation criteria step, so that kind of agreement of, okay, we're going to negotiate. But when it comes to negotiating, only less than 40% of drugs actually meet those targets. So the entire process actually takes a lot longer than it should. And now if we look across different times, over time, we can see that the entire process is indeed getting longer. And again, we see that CADITH review from 2016 to 2018 to 2019 to 2020 is relatively consistent. It's actually that PCP negotiation and the time from negotiation to actually adding the drug on formularies that can take some of the longest and continues to increase. As we said before, just because a positive recommendation is provided to a drug, this doesn't necessarily mean that the drug will actually be listed. So if we look at different drugs that received a positive recommendation between 2003 and 2019, we can see that only 36% of those drugs were listed on all plans. Some were, of course, not listed. And then a large majority of them is listed in some provinces, but not in all of them. So that's, again, that problem that even though there may be agreed upon terms and agreed upon price, some of these provinces can take a really long time before the actual drug is added to their formularies. And now let's talk a little bit more about drugs for rare disease. So again, drugs for rare disease face especially significant challenges. With smaller populations and more heterogeneous populations, running high quality clinical trials can be especially challenging. This then makes both regulatory approval and especially HTA approval especially challenging. It makes cost effectiveness very difficult to demonstrate because drugs for rare disease are often expensive. And even though if we look at the actual costs for drugs for rare disease over the entire population, that's a small percentage, the individual per patient costs are actually quite high, which can be very difficult, especially at that negotiation phase. If we look at this analysis of specifically EMA approved or the European Medicines Agency approved orphan drugs, so these are, again, those drugs that in Europe are considered specifically orphan drugs for rare disease. In Canada, again, we don't have an equivalent status. We can see that only 65% of those were even approved in Health Canada. And then as we look at each specific province, the percent listed goes down even more. And of course, these small provinces are the ones that can be sometimes slowest to listing. So just because the percentage is lower doesn't mean that the drug will never come, but it does mean that at the time, the delay is much higher. And we can see this again, looking at times to listing. So this is median time. And some provinces like BC can be relatively fast. And some small provinces like PEI can be very slow. And again, there's that problem that drug access across the country is not necessarily equitable. So even though the provinces agree that the drug should be available, that doesn't mean that it will actually be available at the same time for everyone. So as I talked about, there's a lot of different steps. There's a lot of different stakeholders. And a lot of these steps also happen one after the other, not necessarily parallel. So sometimes the step 1 and 2 can occur at the same time. So, pre-NOC or pre-approval HTA submissions can occur. But still, after that, it takes quite a lot of time for the provinces to align, to negotiate, and to actually then add that product to their formularies. One of the important takeaways, as we talked about, is, again, step 2, that patient and clinician engagement is really a key aspect of the HTA process, and is one of the key ways that the patient voice can actually be heard. So really make sure that you are aware of the different products that are going through, and use this opportunity to share your perspective and to be engaged. And then, of course, as we talked about, those drugs for rare disease face especially unique challenges and can be especially challenging to make sure that equitable access across the country is available. So thank you everyone for your time, and I hope this was an interesting discussion.
Marta, for giving out your Saturday to give us that snapshot of how drugs come to Canada. I think it's really important for our community because we look to our friends south of the border who see drugs like Koselugo available. So Canada does have this multi-layered process, and in the words of our president, who said it's startling to actually just see the processes and the layers and the committees. And yeah, it's any questions for Marta around and access in Canada? Oh, can you hear Marta?
I can't hear anyone else now, sorry.
Candace?
You can go to the Health Canada website and look, and right now selumetinib, Koselugo, is under review. And as a patient group, we are taking on having a voice in that process. So next week, you'll see a survey. You will also see invitation for a focus group. And we will pull all that together and make a submission for the November 18th deadline. So it's all kind of really come fast. And I know it can be startling and overwhelming to see the drug process, but I think we need to keep our eye on the fact that there is a drug coming. And, you know, again, when the foundation started in 1984, drugs were a dream for NF. So it's still not a perfect process or a perfect system, but we are in it. And there are changes coming that will change the trajectory of NF for our community. Were there any questions? No? No? Yeah. Do you want to come up and say anything? Well, this and then thank you.
Yeah. Oops, I just got my paper. Marta, I just had one kind of follow-up question myself before we let you go and get on with your Saturday. But I was wondering if the slides that you've presented today could be available to everyone here. Would there be a way to make them available? There's a lot of information in there, which was, yeah. Oh, perfect. Okay, maybe we can put them on our website. That'd be great. I don't know. For me, anyway, there was a lot packed in there, so I didn't really get a chance to follow every single piece, and I'd love to be able to go back for that. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your expertise. We really do appreciate it. And best of luck with all of your work to get through those processes. It makes my job feel a little bit less daunting, I'll say that much.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity today, and yeah, thank you again. Bye.
Okay, our next speaker